Hello everyone, it's Herbert here. I'm putting together this little lecture about space and colour in painting and the historical precedents that have led to abstraction, just to give a little bit more background to some of the practical work that we've been doing in the studio over the past few weeks in our painting course. I've called this From Here to There, so let's discuss a bit more about what that means. So from here to there is a succinct way of describing how the old masters dealt with space in a painting and how colour was used to define space in a painting. The old masters relatively, they move from the Renaissance through to the 19th century, so some art histories will say it begins with Giotto, and one of the final old masters and first of the moderns was Eugène Delacroix. I mean, you can get a different perspective from different people, but generally we're talking about a 500-year period where ideas of perspective and illusion were refined and defined to such an extent that we end up with extraordinarily convincing depictions of spaces, be they indoors or outdoors. The type of space that they use you could describe as a from here to there type use of perspective, that from here is where we as the viewer are standing, our own perspective on it, and there is the distance, what you can see behind. It's worth thinking about how they used colour. It's very clear if you walk around the National Gallery or spend any amount of time looking at historical paintings that they understood very, very well the power of colour and how to use it. You can see complementary contrasts, you can see how they work with primary colours or secondary colours to intensify emotions and create certain moods. But essentially, the old master's use of colour was tonal, that the work works on a scale from light to dark. That's not to say that colour isn't deeply important, it is, but their overriding concern was to create a sense of space through a modelled depictions of light and dark. The technical term for that is chiaroscuro. It was refined in the paintings of, say, Caravaggio or Rembrandt. Look at this painting by Rubens. It's a landscape painting. There's a very strong sense of recessive depth. That means it seems to go from the foreground to middle ground to background. It feels extremely convincing the way it goes. How Rubens has achieved this? He's achieved this by reserving the richer, more saturated colours for the foreground. So the trees are very dark, but if you look at where the flash of red, the flash of blue are occurring, it is very much creating a sense that in the foreground is closer to us. And then look at the mountains and the rainbows behind. They're pale and they're blue and they're green, all things that will make a colour appear to be receding. So by working between the scale of light and dark, in this case it's the darker, richer colours at the front and the pale, cooler colours at the back, there is a sense of very convincing depth occurring in Rubens's painting. And this is indicative of how in Western painting, in European painting, perspective had developed. You can trace that through the Renaissance, and by a time of Rubens it was refined to an extremely sophisticated level. Look at any of those paintings, even from artists not well known or historically famous, who are considered to be second rankers of history. it was very, very clearly understood. In some ways, it's a knowledge that has been lost, and one of the reasons it's been lost is because we have found different ways of articulating space, and the key thing that links that is the idea of color. And as with all things, color was freed by science. The Industrial Revolution, if you want to make an equivalent of what was going on in society, because all art responds to its society, the Industrial Revolution is a key here. There were major changes that occurred in the 19th century, and I've put bullet points here. That the 1830s saw the first paint to be industrially manufactured in tubes. That prior to that, it was an extremely labor-intensive process to make paints. It had to be ground to order. They would dry out very quickly. With paint in tubes, you had a great deal of freedom. You were freed from the necessity of grinding your paint, so you could be a lot freer with how you were using paint and color. 10 years later, the next decade, in the 1840s, photography began to become commonplace. Again, Paul Delaroche, the academic French painter, allegedly said when he was shown an early example of photography called a daguerreotype, he said, "From this day onwards, painting is dead." The thinking behind a thought like that is that a lot of the things that painting did, photography was able to pick up and do better, and namely that is an illusionistic, realistic rendering of people and places that immediately, according to this quote, Delaroche, saw that there was a challenge to painting there because you had something that could do it mechanically. And the final one is from the 1850s. So again, within the next decade from that, Michel Eugène Chevreul published the Principles of Harmony and Contrast in Colours, which became an absolutely key text for painters because it explained about scientifically the reasons why colours behaved the way they did, and it's the reason that Impressionists wouldn't use black. To illustrate this point, I'm showing a very famous painting by Turner, the Fighting Temeraire from 1838, so it's right in the middle of that time zone. The reason I show that is that there was, the painting is a metaphor for the old and the new, the old guard being dragged out by the new, so that's quite a good one. But also the yellow that he used in this painting, it was a new type of yellow, chrome yellow, that was brand new, and Turner was fascinated by science, that he was fascinated by photography. He spent a lot of time talking to scientists of the age about these new colors, that this was an era where chemistry was being able to produce different colors that expanded what an artist could achieve through color. And Turner was an early adopter. He certainly wasn't behind the times on this. So a painting that, on the one hand, looks very historical, but actually is completely keyed into what was happening around him in the world at that time. All of these things happen, and it created the perfect conditions for a movement like Impressionism to occur. These things don't just happen spontaneously. They happen because of all sorts of different things that are going on in the world and artists are responding to, and Impressionism is no different. The paint tubes meant that you could paint en plein air, which means paint outside rather than in a studio. That previously, because it was so hard to make the paints, it was really rather difficult to make an ambitious painting out in the field. With paints, you could put that in a box, strap your canvas on your back, and walk out into a field and paint what you saw. So a radically different way of approaching the world. As we said, photography meant that there was no need to be purely illusionistic, that painters such as Monet and Pissarro could start to think about what the sensation of colours was like and try to capture that in the materiality of paint and colour. And to return to Chevreul's theories, they were again talking about the interface between art and science. They were very, very aware of Chevreul's theories, and they were excited by the possibilities because it created for them an understanding that you could accurately depict the transient sensations of how light was playing at a very particular time of day, whereas people such as Rubens and the old masters, this would have been a very low priority when they were painting their landscapes, which were primarily painted in their studio. They might have been worked up from sketches from the field, but the paintings themselves weren't done with the model in front of them, i.e. a landscape, whereas Monet and the Impressionists would have been working in this way. Chevreul's theories helps them to understand how to use colour to create the realism of this situation, that the way a shadow looks, a shadow isn't black, a shadow has colour in it, and that Chevreul allowed them to access that through paint by the way that they were mixing their paints. Now, to talk about the Impressionists' use of colour and space, they continue to conform to the from here to there rule of perspective. That there is a tonality in their paintings, that there is a sense of receding depth. If you look at this painting by Monet, there is a very strong sense of space, and it feels very convincing within it. So it does seem to be conforming to the painting that we saw in Rubens. However, we have to look closely at the difference, and a major difference is in how colour is being used. In particular, pay attention to the bridge on the right, which is in shadow. And if one looks at how the shadow is being handled there and compares that to Rubens's use of shadow, which is here, it's radically different. Rubens was working with tonality as a scale of light and dark was the most important thing. So using black to depict a shadow worked extremely well for him. Because the Impressionists were looking at light, they were looking at color, they were looking at the transient effects of light, how light changes through a day depending on where the sun is. Working like that would have seemed too crude. It didn't conform to Chevreul's theories. And looking at the bridge, look at it's alive with color. They've completely seen that a shadow isn't dark, it isn't black. It's got all sorts of color in there. The way that they're achieving that color is through, it's not through dulling it with black, mixing black. This is where a lot of you will have heard the famous rule, never use black in your painting. This is where it comes from, that they are using the complementary color to draw the saturation out of that color. So if you look at the blue in that bridge that's making the struts of the bridge, it's darker type of blue, and that would be achieved by mixing some orange into it to take it down. You can even see below it here that's a very sort of desaturated orange in there. So that by mixing blue and orange together, they become much more dull and start to create a very convincing sense of we've all seen that on a summer's day, the way a shadow, the play of light reflecting off the water in a shadow is a very particular and quite magical thing. And Monet has done an extremely interesting job in trying to capture that fleeting impression in paint. The other thing to think about, and again, this is where we link to Chevreul's theories, is look at the mast and the water. Orange and blue are complementary colours. It was also noted by the theory that there is something very particular about orange and blue, that they more so than other complementary contrasts, they intensify one another. That when you have an orange next to a blue, it makes the orange seem more orange and the blue seems more blue. It's something that Van Gogh used an awful lot. If you look at Van Gogh, you'll see this repeats again and again, his use of orange and blue. It was an extreme, they create a real intensity between the two, and they understood that. So Monet, by using the orange to create this very powerful set of verticals in the foreground, set against the horizontal feeling of the blue lake, very, very powerfully creates depth in that. And that depth is being created through color relations, not through the tonal modeling that we were seeing in Rubens. And I think that is really rather significant. We're going to scroll ahead now to a crucial painter if we are discussing how space in painting is dealt with, and that's Paul Cezanne. It really is important to think about what Cezanne was doing, because actually he's rejecting, he's often considered to be a post-impressionist alongside people like Gauguin, Van Gogh. Cezanne's the other big name. He is rejecting from here to their perspective. He's also rejecting some of what the Impressionists were, you know, the adherence that the Impressionists had to here to there is being rejected by Cezanne. He wanted to make this more real, that he saw the potential in color relationships to create a sense of space, that he understood that what we spoke about here that's going on with those masts, he realized that you could take that even further. He wanted to get into the reality of how we see. So we see with binocular vision. We don't actually see like this painting, and if we go to the Rubens, it's assuming that there's one kind of point that we see towards. And actually the reality of how we look at things is we see it with two eyes. Binocular vision really does change our perception of objects. We understand that objects have a weight and a volume, but there's a contradiction in that painting is flat. It's inherently a flat surface. So Cezanne was trying to find a way of depicting volume within two dimensions, which is the obsession with, particularly in the 20th century, if you look at a lot of 20th century painting, that is something that became exceptionally important. Things to note about Cezanne was that he used little to no drawing. He's working with flat planes of color and reduced geometric forms. So everything is creating space by color relationships, planes of color abutting one another, creating a sense of space. The sense of space and volume is created all by color, yet we are left with the contradictory message that this is also flat. So that is so important, and he's such an interesting painter to look at because of that they have an integrity a formal integrity, and they have an absolute convincing sense of space, volume, and weight. Yet they're done. They look so tremendously flat as well. But the contradiction within that is something that was noted by a younger generation of artists and run with. Most notably, that was from Fauvism, which was '05 to '08. They took it to the next logical extreme, whereby color was the subject of Fauvism. They used it in wild ways that if you look at this painting by Cezanne, there's completely no sense of depth that was going on in the Impressionists. It certainly has something more in common with the Cezanne, the Mont Saint Victoire, but the way colour's being used, it's pushing at those rules. Those rules are being sort of exploded. The colour is becoming freer. It isn't. They're not trying to, like Monet was trying to mix the exact sort of effect of a shadow within a tree that you saw at a certain time. That they're picking colours that they felt expressed something of that space and that time. Moving on from that, sort of a lot of the Fauvists became interested in Cubism, and there is it is the next logical step in a way to the type of space that Cezanne was using. The idea that trying to capture something about the reality of how we look, that we don't look through one point perspective. We see things from different angles. Our head moves, we will move around a subject on a table. And so they're trying to find a way of honestly depicting this on a 2D surface. They did this by fracturing perspective. So you're seeing different angles of the same object from different from different viewpoints, from different angles. If you look at some of Cezanne's still lives, you'll see what I mean, how that links, because often the perspective is very peculiar in Cezanne's. The still lifes of Cezanne feel like they've been tipped. They don't seem to make sense, other than if you started to think about how our eyes actually perceive things through binocular vision. The Cubists took this even further. That the lack of colour is worth thinking about, that they were trying not to confuse it. So by using colour, the focus was on form over colour. It didn't last for very long. It's not long at all before both Braque, Picasso, Juan Gris, colour returned to it after a very short amount of time, because there was only so far you could go through the tonalities that they were working through in Cubism. And finally, the from here to there of the old masters has become the from here to there, and there of abstraction. That suddenly, when you've broken the rules of the old masters in the way that Fauvism and Cubism did, everything becomes available. And the generation that was through Cubism and also the artists who followed it saw that there was the potential to remove the model, that it didn't need to be of landscapes anymore, that you could be working with pure relations of colour and form in painting through abstract art. And I've put a range of different 20th century work there. There's Kandinsky, who was an original expressionist. There's Mondrian, who was working with geometric abstraction. There's Malevich, Casimir Malevich, famous black square. And there's Joan Mitchell, who is representative of post-war abstract expressionist painting. So through that is a refinement of ideas of space that were being set in motion through the 19th century and really came to fruition in the early middle years of the 20th century. So I hope that has put a bit of context behind some of the things that we're learning. If you have any questions, I'm always happy to answer them. So thank you very much for listening, and good luck with your painting. Goodbye.